Dr. Stevens stepped into the office with a smile, and after looking over the charts before him, comes to sit down in front of Chris. He reaches up and pulls Chris's eyelids down to examine each eye, asking for Chris to look left, then right, up, and finally down. "Have you ever blacked out before, Chris?" His questioning eyes awaited an answer. Seeing that he would not be getting one, Dr. Stevens turned to Clarissa and repeats the question. "Has he ever blacked out before?" Clarissa looked at Chris oddly and answers for him. "No, he's never passed out or blacked out at all that I can recall." Chris inhales deeply and seems to wake up out of his daze. "When did I pass out?" He seemed annoyed by the question and looked back and forth between the doctor and his wife. "Clarissa, when did I pass out?" He looked at her again and thoughts rolled through his head. Silver buttons grimace across his mind's eye and he tries to force them away. "I just fell, I think, that's all. I didn't black out." He does his best to reassure them, but it is obvious that the doctor doesn't believe it. Clarissa says that you've not been sleeping well. The doctor asks, drawing the conversation back on track. "What?" Chris speaks and then is interrupted by Clarissa. "Well, you have been sleeping, but not a lot. Every day you look like you're going to pass out by the time you get home from work. I'm worried, Chris, that's all." She takes his hand in hers and squeezes it gently. Reluctantly, Chris replies, "Yeah, I don't sleep well. It's just work and stress. It's just life. I'm fine. You can't die from a lack of sleep." His voice sounds dismissive and hollow. Dr. Stevens nods. "It may not be able to kill you itself, but I assure you a lack of sleep can kill you. Fall asleep driving or black out again. Maybe next time you're fine again. Maybe next time you hit your head on the shower wall and never wake up. It's serious, Chris. You need to treat it as so." The doctor stood up and wrote in his notepad. "Take some time off from work if you need to. I'll write you a prescription for some sleeping aids. You don't have to take them every day, but when you need them, take them." Dr. Stevens hands the prescription to Clarissa and before excusing himself from the room offers one final statement. "Make sure he takes these, at least a few times a week. He needs to get rest. If these don't work, let me know and I'll change them. Let's see what we can work out. Maybe a sleep study and an overnight stay?" In minutes, Clarissa and Chris have gathered their things and are making their way out of the doctor's office. Crossing the lobby, Chris stops momentarily, his head spinning, and a methodical pulsing sensation wipes across the world and sends shivers through his body. Trying to shake the feeling off, Chris does his best to stay in stride with Clarissa as they exit the office, but as soon as the doors open before them, he feels a warmth surrounding him, and then the world is black. He awakes from the alarm calling out as it so often does. Turning it off, Chris sits up in bed. The world seems so distant, a faraway memory of normality. He struggles to remember anything after the doctor's office the night before, but not even a trace of the memories remain. Clarissa shifts in the bed beside him under the covers. He turns to watch her, his thoughts questioning and shaming his decisions and actions. He spins his wedding ring on his finger and stands up to greet the day. Dressed and ready to leave, he pauses at the kitchen counter, taking the last mouthful of his coffee before making his way towards the door. He feels dizzy. The world around him seems to sway and move as if looking into water. He steadies himself by leaning on the door, his head resting over the peephole, and he looks silently out of it into the hall. The hall sits empty, but for a single person staring back at him, snapping him back to reality. "Mary?" he whispers and opens the door. Greeting him with a smile as he closes the door behind him, Mary stands in the centre of the hall, her white blouse peeking from under her long black coat. "I was worried about you. I haven't seen you in a few days." She moved towards him and pulled him in close to her. "Is she here?" She smiles wickedly and motions behind him into the apartment. "She's here, isn't she?" Mary smiles and pushes him back towards his door, kissing him as she does so. Chris breaks the kiss and tries to push Mary back, but she leans in further and pulls his face to hers again passionately. Running her hands down his body and thrusting them into his pants, she grabs him as she breaks the kiss. The darkness in her eyes causes pause as Chris, wide-eyed, looked at her. "What are you doing?" he whispered, trying to remove her hand from his pants, but to no avail. Maybe she should just know. Mary pauses for a moment and squeezes him gently in her hand before continuing. She kisses his lower lip again and with her free hand starts to slam the surface of the door with a repeated knock. Chris pushed back from the door, trying to stop the knocking, and as he does, Mary breaks the kiss, quickly removing her hand from his pants. "See you in the car." She turned and ran down the hall as the door behind him opened. "Chris?" Clarissa's eyes burn from the light from the hall. She's wearing little more than a long shirt as she peeks from the door. "What are you doing?" Chris just stood there staring at her for a moment. "I'm so sorry, babe. I thought I'd forgotten my keys, but I found them." He pulled the keys from his pocket and shook them. They were in the wrong pocket. "I'm so sorry. Go back to sleep." Clarissa nods slightly. "Who were you talking to?" she questions. "What?" "No one. Must have heard me talking to myself." He looked down the hall, which sat empty. The door at the end, heading to the stairs and to the parking lot below, sits open. "I could have sworn I heard you talking just before I opened the door." She trailed off and yawned. "Well, you better get going or you're going to be late." She called to him with her index finger, and as he approached she leaned in and gave him a small kiss on the lips. "Have a good day at work, my big strong man." She smiled and patted his chest with her hand. "See you tonight." She stepped back into the apartment, closing the door, and Chris turned towards the parking lot. Exiting the building and approaching his car, he looked back upward to his apartment to find the lights off again and the windows dark. Relieved that Clarissa had believed his lies, he nervously and excitedly awaited Mary in his car. However, opening the door, it sat empty. He paused for a moment and looked around the lot. All the usual cars are there, and nothing looked out of the ordinary, but Mary is nowhere to be found. The drive into work was a complete daze of flashbacks and memories of his various times with Mary. He smiled to himself unknowingly and drove out of the city and up the hill towards the Canary Button Company. The darkness led the way, almost beckoning him closer, until he was again walking through the gates of the plant with only one thought on his mind: Mary. Walking through the plant, he searched for her, first at her office. It sat empty, but her coffee cup was still warm, and he sipped from it, searching for a simple taste of the woman he craved. All the offices were mostly empty, so he decided that she must be in the main plant building, waiting for him. Proceeding down into the plant, he walked past the production areas, exchanging greetings with other workers as he did so, and never stopping his eyes searching. Making his way through the east wing, he made his way downstairs into the maintenance areas under the plant. The planning room sat down the hall from him, its light calling out to him as he approached. Mary stood with her back to him, moving things around in a brown box. His entire body craved her as he moved quickly to be behind her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. His hands moved across her body as he pulled her near and kissed her neck. "I thought you were going to meet me in the car," he said. Mary's scream startles him, and he instinctively releases her and steps back. Mary spun on her heels and slapped him as hard as she could. The nerves in his face exploded in pain as he stumbled back onto the planning table. "Mary, what the hell?" He held his cheek. "How dare you?" Mary screamed at him. She slapped him again, repeatedly pushing him away from her, before making her way towards the door. "I thought you wanted to—" Christopher pauses as Mary turned to face him. "I wanted to what?" she asked angrily, her eyes cutting through the distance, and hate that swelled up in them. Then the anger faded into sadness. "I wanted to be assaulted." Mary turned to the door and as she exited made a final statement. "When Dava gets in, I'm filing a report with HR." Stunned by the events that just unfolded in front of him, Christopher sits leaning against the table. "What the fuck?" he says to himself, rubbing his cheek again in an attempt to dissipate the pain, his head spinning the world around him again, and flickers as if he was watching it on an old TV. Everything is faded and fuzzy. At just after 9 in the morning, a call came across his radio to report to HR. When he did so, he'd already known that the things that were bad were about to get worse. Dava Johnston, a small woman that would have reminded Christopher of a nun if it wasn't for her constant glare and overall hateful attitude to everyone around her, sat at her desk on the phone, and upon seeing Christopher standing at the door, motioned for him to come in and have a seat, to which he obliged. He looked nervously back out into the hallway. Office 205, sat only 40 feet further down the aisleway to the south. He knew Mary was there, but her perfume still lingered in the air of Dava's office. Its scent comforting him in the moment. He closed his eyes and Mary's image danced through his mind for a moment before Dava, clearing his throat, snapped him back to the reality he was facing. "Mr. Johnson, how are you this morning?" Dava asked, her voice hinting that this conversation was surely going to go downhill from here. I'm good. How are you?" Christopher shifts uneasily in his chair. Dava looked over her small glasses at him and nodded. "Care to tell me what happened with Miss Ridley?" "Nothing." Christopher tried to maintain eye contact but failed before continuing. "It's just a misunderstanding, honestly." "It sure didn't sound like a misunderstanding, Mr. Johnson." Dava wrote something down on the papers in front of her. "Didn't sound like a misunderstanding to Miss Ridley either." The world around Christopher seemed to move like it were fluid, and Dava's movements before Christopher struggled to maintain his focus. In the back of his mind, a flashback of Mary on the table in the planning office repeated like a skipping record as the conversation continued. "Mr. Johnson, I'm sorry, but we treat these types of concerns very seriously. It's unprofessional to say the least, and criminal at the worst." Dava pushes the intercom button on her desk. It connects and the red light illuminates. "Please come to my office. We have one on exit," she states flatly. The next few minutes seemed to blur around him, and the next thing he realized was that he was being led from the building with termination papers in hand. In the daze of what was happening upon his exit, there was one moment of clarity as he departed. Mary stood just inside her office when they passed, and their eyes locked as they did so. Christopher offered a small wave before continuing on. Standing at his car, the world seemed to slowly become clear again, and his mind felt empty. Christopher pondered his explanation to Clarissa when he got home. He unlocked the door and sat inside his car. As he did so, a small lump in his pocket drew his attention. He reached into it and withdrew the keys to the east wing. The darkness within him smiles knowingly, and Christopher started his car to exit the property. Only 3 blocks away from his apartment, Christopher stopped along the side of the road. He thought over the events of the day and again debated on how he was going to tell his wife that he was fired, let alone what he was fired for. Sitting in the car, his eyes were drawn over to a small garage, its doors open with multiple cars in its various bays. The help wanted sign called him, and even though he thought against it, he eventually got out of his car and approached the garage, heading towards the door labelled office. The greasy man behind the desk talked on the phone while smoking a large cigar, which filled the room with a musky smell, somewhere between an ashtray and a dirty sock. Christopher looked the dirty office over and wondered to himself what he was even doing, considering applying for a job here. Just as he was about to excuse himself and leave the office, the man behind the desk put the phone down, his gruff voice filling the office. "Can I help you with something?" Christopher looked up and smiled nervously. "I saw the sign out front. You still looking to hire help?" The man behind the counter looked Christopher over. "Don't look like much of a mechanic." Christopher smiled and replied, "I worked at the Canary Button Company for the last few years as an electrician and maintenance man, but before that I was a mechanic." "Canary Button Company, you say?" The man behind the counter perked up slightly and appeared to reflect upon something before continuing. "Yeah, I worked there too, long ago." The man moved around the counter and put out his big meaty hand. "I'm Gus." Shaking his hand, Christopher introduces himself. "Christopher, you work there too, huh?" Gus nodded and gave a wicked smile. "I did. Did you see them?" "See who?" Christopher asked, although he already knew the answer. Gus eyed him silently for a moment and nodded to himself, rubbing his hands together. "Yeah, you saw them." He looked around the office, moving towards the window, and looked out into the direction of the plant. "I can still hear it at times. It's soothing." In the back of his mind, a rhythmical metallic pulse drew his attention, and Christopher moved towards the window himself before stopping again when Gus spoke. "You start tomorrow. Tell no one that you saw them. Tell no one." "What?" Christopher stuttered as Gus turned to face him. For a moment the world flickered. Gus stood before him, his eye sockets emptied, and the eyes were each replaced with a silver button. Before he could react, the world again appeared to be normal. Gus stood smiling, a bead of sweat dripping down his brow. "Tomorrow, 7 a.m. Christopher nodded and replied the same. Tomorrow, 7 a.m. Then he exited the office back to his car. The darkness of the Canary Button Company wrapped him in its warmth, and all again was right in the world. The keys to the East Wing shimmered in the daylight as he drove his way across town towards home. Hey fearsome friends. It's chilly today. My hands feel almost numb working here, and I'm in Spain. I can hear the wind blowing outside, which makes the house start talking. I love it. Please go check out my Patreon, and if you like what you see there, then please consider joining. It's only $1 a month, and for that you get early access to all my recordings, plus the ability to download them. I love you, and remember, keep being creepy.